Rattlesnake Gorge, Wyoming Territory, the 9th of November, 1884. The sky that morning was a lyre, stretched thin and blue above the canyon, as if December were a rumor and not a promise already tightening its grip on the high country. For Marek Zielinski had carried the sound of his own death, still ringing in the frozen air 3 weeks after the fact. Not his death exactly, his brother's. But the distinction felt academic when you were the one left holding a violin case and a foreclosure notice in a town that had no use for either. Pyotr had been the useful one. Pyotr had been the bridge builder, the man the railroad paid to span the impossible gaps between canyon walls so iron track could stitch the territory together. He had hands like shovels and a mind like a compass. And when the trestle at Devil's Elbow collapsed under a load of green timber that should never have been sent across, Pyotr Zielinski went down with it, 40 feet into a frozen creek bed. The sound, they said, was like a ship breaking apart. The railroad agent, a man named Croft, with a jaw like a shovel blade and eyes the color of creek mud, arrived 3 days after the burial. He did not knock. He walked into the small cabin that Pyotr had built with his own hands at the edge of the company claim, and set a folded paper on the table between the violin case and a half-eaten plate of beans. "The cabin belongs to the Wyoming and Pacific," Croft said, not looking at Marek but at the walls, appraising them the way a butcher appraises a carcass. "Your brother had a company lease. The lease died with him. You have until Friday." Friday was 2 days away. "I can work," Marek said. His English was still accented, the consonants hard and angular, shaped by a childhood in the salt mining towns south of Krakow. "I know timber. I know stone. Pyotr taught me the principles of load and span." Croft finally looked at him. It was not a cruel look. It was worse. It was the look of a man who has already made his calculation and found the sum to be 0. "You're a fiddle player, Zielinski. The company needs builders, not concert halls. The cabin goes to Holloway's crew on Friday. I'm sorry about your brother. Truly." He paused at the door. "There's a southbound coach on Saturday if you can make it to Rawlins." That pause, that single word, truly, was the only crack Marek ever saw in the man's efficiency. It closed as quickly as it appeared, and then Croft was gone, his boots crunching on the frost-hardened mud of the company road. Marek Zielinski was an outsider twice over in Rattlesnake Gorge. He was Polish in a town of Scots and Germans. He was a musician in a town that valued only the labor of hands and the breaking of stone. The men of the railroad camp regarded him with the tolerant bewilderment, usually reserved for a dog that had learned to walk on its hind legs. Amusing, but fundamentally useless. Pyotr had been his shield, his translator, his reason for existing in this brutal corner of the world. Without Pyotr, Marek was not even a loose thread in the communal fabric. He was a thread from a different garment entirely, and no one could see where he might fit. The town, such as it was, consisted of 14 cabins, a company store, a sawmill, and the narrow gauge rail spur that connected them to the main line 20 miles south. The people were not heartless. Mrs. Gunderson left a jar of pickled beets on his step. Old Emmett Ferris pressed $2 into his hand outside the stall and muttered something about God's plan. But their sympathy was a shallow creek in a drought, and it dried up the moment the first real cold snap hit, and every family turned inward, counting their cordwood and checking the chinking in their walls. Pity was quickly chased away by self-preservation. That was the arithmetic of the frontier. On Thursday evening, the night before his eviction, Marek sat in the cabin and opened his brother's journal. It was not a diary. It was a builder's notebook, filled with diagrams and calculations, sketches of trestle designs, and notes on the properties of different timbers. Pyotr had been meticulous. Every joint, every load-bearing angle, every observation about how the canyon winds affected a span was recorded in his cramped, precise handwriting. But scattered among the engineering were other notes. Older knowledge. Things their father had taught them both in the salt mines of Wieliczka, where the Zielinski family had worked for 3 generations. Notes about how the deep earth held a constant temperature, summer and winter. About how the miners would warm themselves not with fire but with the passive heat of the rock itself, hundreds of feet below the surface. About thermal mass, though their father had never used that term. He had called it pamiętanie, the memory of stone. The surface is a fool, Marek, Piotr had written in the margin of one page, quoting their father directly. It believes whatever the sky tells it. Hot today, cold tomorrow, but the earth below remembers only one temperature, and it is the temperature of patience. Marek closed the journal. He looked at the violin case. He looked at the foreclosure notice, and he thought about the collapsed bridge at Devil's Elbow. Everyone in Rattlesnake Gorge knew the bridge. It lay 1.5 miles up the canyon, a tangle of shattered timbers and twisted iron spanning a narrow gorge where Bitter Creek cut through the rock. The railroad had written it off. The new line was being routed south, around the canyon entirely. The bridge was wreckage, a monument to failure, and the gorge beneath it was considered worthless, too narrow for building, too steep for cattle, too haunted by Piotr's death for anyone to visit without a shudder. Marek visited it the next morning, Friday, carrying everything he owned on his back. His eviction was quiet. No one watched from windows. The cabin simply emptied and refilled, like a lung breathing in a new man, breathing out the old. Holloway's crew was already measuring for bunks before Marek had reached the tree line. He stood at the edge of the ruined bridge and looked down. The gorge was perhaps 30 feet deep and barely 15 feet wide at the bottom. Bitter Creek ran through it, shallow and half-frozen, threading between boulders. The collapsed timbers of the bridge lay in a chaos of angles, some still connected by iron bolts, others scattered like bones. It was a graveyard of engineering. But Marek saw something else. The south-facing wall of the gorge was dark rock, almost black, a dense basalt that absorbed every scrap of the thin November sun. He climbed down carefully, using the fallen timbers as a ladder, and pressed his bare hand against the rock face. It was not warm, but it was not the killing cold of the surface either. It held a faint residual heat, the memory of the afternoon sun stored in its dense mineral structure. Pamiętanie, the memory of stone, and the fallen timbers, dozens of them, thick railroad-grade beams of Douglas fir, already cut to length, already notched and bored for bolts. They were not wreckage, they were building materials. A fortune in pre-milled lumber lying in a gorge that nobody wanted. Over the next 3 weeks, Marek Zielinski did something that would have baffled any sane observer. He built a shelter in the gorge, using the bones of his brother's bridge. The first days were the hardest. He worked from dawn until his hands bled through his gloves, then worked by firelight until his vision blurred. He selected the soundest timbers and dragged them to the narrowest point of the gorge, where the walls were barely 10 feet apart. He laid them across the gap, beam by beam, creating a low ceiling that turned the gorge into a roofed channel. Each beam he placed according to Piotr's diagrams, the joints interlocking, the weight distributed the way his brother had designed. Not fighting gravity but channeling it. He chinked the gaps between the beams with a mixture of clay from the creek bed and dried grass, packing it thick. On top of the timber roof he piled stones, then earth, then more stones. Layer after layer until the roof was nearly 3 feet thick, a massive slab of thermal mass that would absorb heat during the day and release it slowly through the night. The south-facing rock wall became one wall of his shelter. He built no wall against it. Instead, He let the dark basalt stand exposed inside the living space, a natural radiator that collected the weak winter sun through a gap he left in the roof beams, a narrow slot oriented precisely south. During the short daylight hours, the sun fell through this slot and struck the black rock directly, heating it. The rock held that heat for hours after sunset, radiating it into the enclosed space like a slow, patient furnace. For the north wall, he stacked the shattered timbers into a double-thickness barrier, filling the gap between them with creek gravel and clay. This was not a wall in the conventional sense. It was a dam against the cold, and its sheer mass meant that the killing wind could howl against it all night and barely steal a degree from the interior. He lined the floor with flat creek stones, fitted tightly together, and built a small fire pit at the west end of the shelter, with a flue made from a section of iron pipe he salvaged from the bridge wreckage. The flue ran horizontally beneath the stone floor for 8 feet before turning upward and exiting through the timber roof. Every inch of that horizontal run radiated heat into the stones below, turning the floor into a warm surface that heated the air above it through convection. His father would have recognized the principle. It was a crude version of the hypercaust, the Roman heating system that the salt miners of Poland had adapted centuries ago for warming their underground chambers. The work was punishing. His fingers cracked and bled. His back seized on the 9th day, and he spent a full morning unable to stand, lying on the cold ground, staring up at the timber ceiling he had built, wondering if Croft had been right after all. But on the 10th day, he lit the first fire in the completed flue and felt the stones beneath him grow warm, and the sensation was so startling, so profound, that he pressed his cheek against the floor and wept. Not from sorrow, from recognition. His father's voice was in those warm stone. Piotr's engineering was in those beams. The dead were holding him up. By late November, the shelter was complete. It was ugly. It was invisible, really just a depression in the gorge covered by earth and stone, with the wreckage of a bridge incorporated so seamlessly that a person could walk across the top without realizing they were standing on someone's roof. The entrance was on the east end, sheltered by a fallen timber that served as a windbreak, and you had to duck and turn sideways to get in. Inside, it was another world. The trapper, Loomis, was the first to stumble on it. He had been running his lines along Bitter Creek and smelled smoke where no smoke should be. He followed it to the gorge and found Marek sitting on the warm stone floor, reading Piotr's journal by the light of a tallow candle, the violin case open beside him. The air inside was warm enough that Marek had his coat off. Loomis stood in the entrance, snow melting from his beard, his mouth open. "You living down here?" he asked. "I am." "In the bridge?" In what the bridge became, Loomis told everyone in town, and the reaction was exactly what Marek had expected. Amusement, derision, concern for his sanity. Silas Blackwood, the railroad senior engineer who had designed the replacement route around the gorge, was the most vocal. Blackwood was not a small man in stature or opinion. He had overseen the construction of 11 bridges across Wyoming territory and considered himself the foremost authority on what timber could and could not do. "The pole is living in the wreckage," Blackwood told the men at the company store, shaking his head with a kind of disgusted wonder. "He's made a burrow out of his brother's failure. The first hard freeze will crack those timbers like matchsticks. The whole gorge will fill with snow, and we'll find him in the spring. If we find him at all." He paused then, and something complicated moved across his face. He had liked Piotr. He had respected the man's work, had even borrowed one of his joint designs for the new southern route. The thought of Piotr's little brother dying in the ruins of Piotr's last project stirred something in Blackwood that he did not care to examine too closely. He turned back to his coffee. "Somebody should talk sense to him," he muttered. But nobody volunteered, and Blackwood did not go himself. December came. not as a visitor but as a judge. The first real blizzard hit on December 3rd, a 3-day monster that buried Rattlesnake Gorge under 4 feet of snow and drove temperatures to 30 below. The wind was a living thing, a howling predator that found every crack and gap and seam in every structure the town possessed. Holloway's crew, now occupying Piotr's old cabin, burned through a week's worth of cordwood in 2 days. The company store lost its north-facing window to a gust that hit like a fist. Mrs. Gunderson's chimney cracked and filled her cabin with smoke, and she spent a night in the store with her 3 children, all of them coughing and shivering. In the gorge, Marek fed his fire. The flue warmed the stones. The stones warmed the air. The massive timber and earth roof absorbed the cold of the blizzard and held it at bay, its sheer thermal mass creating a buffer that would take days to penetrate. The black basalt wall, which had stored the weak sun of the previous days, radiated its memory of warmth into the small space. The temperature inside the shelter held steady, cool but survivable, while the world above turned lethal. He played his violin. The sound was strange in the enclosed space, resonant and warm, bouncing off the clay-chinked timbers and the smooth rock wall. He played a mazurka his father had loved, then a slow, aching melody that Piotr used to hum while working. The music filled the shelter the way heat filled the stones, slowly, completely, becoming part of the structure itself. Loomis the trapper, caught out by the storm, remembered the gorge. He fought his way through the blinding snow, following Bitter Creek by feel, and found the entrance by the sound of the violin. He crawled inside, half-frozen, his left hand white with frostbite, and Marek wrapped it in warm cloth and gave him broth heated on the flue stones. "I can hear you playing from the rim," Loomis said, his teeth chattering. "Thought I was dying. Thought it was angels." "Not angels," Marek said. "Just a fiddle player in a rotten bridge." The blizzard lasted 3 days. When it broke, Rattlesnake Gorge counted its losses. 2 horses dead. The company store roof partially collapsed. 14 cords of firewood consumed. Every cabin in town had ice on its interior walls. The new southern rail spur was buried under a drift 12 feet deep and would not be cleared for weeks. Marek emerged from the gorge on the morning of the 7th, blinking in the pale sunlight. His fire was still burning. His shelter was intact. Loomis walked beside him, his frost-bitten hand bandaged but saved. Blackwood saw them coming down the company road. He was standing outside the store, overseeing repairs to the roof, his face raw and red from the cold. He watched the 2 men approach, Marek carrying his violin case, Loomis walking steadily on feet that should have been frozen solid. Blackwood was a man who understood structural integrity. He could look at a bridge and tell you where it would fail. He looked at Marek Zielinski and saw something that did not fit any of his calculations. A man who should be dead and was not. "Where did you shelter?" he asked Loomis. "In the gorge." "In the bridge." Loomis held up his bandaged hand. "He saved my fingers. The place is warm, Silas, warm like a house in June. I don't understand it, but I sat there in my shirt sleeves while the storm tried to kill everything above." Blackwood looked at Marek for a long time. The wind cut between them, sharp with ice crystals. Marek said nothing. He did not need to. "Show me," Blackwood said. They walked to the gorge together, and Marek led the big engineer down through the entrance and into the shelter. Blackwood had to duck almost double to get through. When he straightened inside, the warmth hit him like a wave. He stood perfectly still, his breath slowing, his hands unclenching from fists he did not know he had been making. He reached out and touched the basalt wall. Warm. He knelt and pressed his palm to the stone floor. Warm. He looked at the flue running beneath the stones, at the massive earth and timber roof, at the narrow solar slot that was already catching the morning light and directing it onto the dark rock. "This is not a burrow," he said quietly. His voice had lost its authority. It was the voice of a student. "This is engineering." "It is my brother's engineering," Marek said, "and my father's memory." "The timbers," Blackwood said, running his hand along a beam. "These are the joints from the Devil's Elbow trestle. I recognize Piotr's notching. But the application, the thermal principles, this is something else entirely. In Poland, the miners heat their deep chambers this way. The earth holds warmth the way a stone holds the memory of the sun. You must not fight the cold, Mr. Blackwood. You must give the heat a home heavy enough that the cold cannot evict it." Blackwood stood in that warm silence for a full minute. He was not a man accustomed to being wrong. He had built his reputation on being right, on knowing what wood could do and what it could not. But the evidence was all around him, pressing against his palms, filling his lungs with warm air. His entire career had been built on the assumption that shelter meant persistence, that you fought the cold with thicker walls and bigger fires. This man, this fiddle player, had built something that did not fight the cold at all. It simply existed beneath it, beside it, within it, untouched. "I will send men to learn this," Blackwood said. It was not a request. It was an admission. "Send whoever wants to come," Marek said. "I will teach them." Piotr would have wanted that. They came, not all at once and not without grumbling. But the second blizzard hit on December 19th, worse than the first, and this time Marek's gorge shelter was not a curiosity, but a destination. Mrs. Gunderson brought her children. Old Emmett Ferris came with his bad hip and his jar of whiskey. Holloway's crew, the men who now slept in Piotr's cabin, came last, shamefaced and shivering. Marek turned no one away. He did not mention the eviction. He did not remind them of the foreclosure notice, or the 2-day deadline, or the southbound coach to Rawlins. He made room. He taught them how to heat stones in the fire and place them along the walls to extend the thermal mass. He showed the children how the flue worked, tracing the path of heat with a stick while they sat cross-legged on the warm floor, their eyes wide. And in the evenings, when the blizzard screamed above and the shelter held steady, he played his violin. By spring, Blackwood had redesigned 3 cabins in Rattlesnake Gorge, using Marek's principles. Earth berm at north walls, stone floors with underfloor flues, smaller rooms with greater thermal mass. The cabins burned half the wood and held twice the warmth. The railroad, noting the reduced timber consumption and the survival rate of the gorge settlement through the worst winter in territorial memory, sent an engineer from Cheyenne to study the designs. The engineer found Marek in the gorge, sitting on the warm stone floor, playing a slow Polish melody that echoed off the basalt wall. The journal was open beside him, Piotr's precise diagrams annotated now in Marek's looser hand, the old knowledge and the new engineering merging on the page like 2 rivers joining. They called it the Zielinski method. Marek never corrected them, though it was really 3 methods intertwined. His father's deep earth wisdom, Piotr's structural precision, and his own stubborn refusal to die in a way that made no music. Years later, travelers passing through Rattlesnake Gorge would notice something strange. In the deepest part of the canyon, where the old rail bridge had collapsed, there was a depression in the ground that was always free of snow, even in the coldest months. If you stood very still and the wind was right, you could feel a faint warmth rising from the earth. And sometimes, the old-timers said, you could hear something in that warmth. A faint, resonant hum, as if the stones themselves were remembering a melody. Now the lessons of Marek Zielinski are not just about surviving a winter in a Wyoming gorge. They are about a way of seeing what is already in front of you. We live in our own versions of Rattlesnake Gorge, surrounded by the wreckage of things that failed, collapsed bridges we walk past every day, Ruins we have written off as worthless. We trust the experts who tell us to build higher, burn more, push harder against the cold. And we are surprised when the cold still finds its way in. What collapsed bridge are you walking past every day? What breakage in your life holds timber that is still sound, still notched, still waiting to be laid across the gap? What knowledge did someone leave you, written in the margins of a journal you have not opened in years, humming in a melody you have almost forgotten? The world will tell you that you are building a grave. Your own experts will call it madness. They will shake their heads and walk away, certain they already know how the story ends. But the gorge is waiting. The stones remember warmth. The timbers are still sound. Start peering the entrance. This story is a historically inspired reconstruction. The characters are fictional and the events are a dramatization of principles related to survival and shelter. The content presented here is for entertainment and inspirational purposes only, and does not constitute professional engineering, architectural, or survival advice. Always consult with qualified professionals before undertaking any building or survival-related activities.